My name is Gary Grossman. I'm the Associate Director for Academic Programs with the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. And it's my pleasure to introduce, it's a real pleasure, to introduce our special guest, Olcay Ünver of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, has been a colleague and friend of mine for more than 20 years. And in those 20 years, we've had times and projects to work on together, such that I could probably take up the entire time we have available to tell stories of our relationship, which I won't do. But I hope you will indulge me with one. And that is, when I was working in Turkey, and I worked in Turkey for around 25 years. When I was there early, I was working with the various ministries, with, the World Bank had relationships with. And there was a way that you met the leaders of agencies, the leaders of ministries, and you go in with your translator, and you say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Minister." And he'll say something like, in Turkish, "Good afternoon, Dr. Grossman." And we'll sit down, we'll have tea. He will say, "Welcome to Turkey, and I hope your work goes well." And I say, "Thank you, Mr. Minister." And we conclude, and hopefully I just try not to make a faux pas that would destroy my ability to do anything. But that's really the nature of it. Now, one day, I was told by a number of people, in fact, my friend Ed Kirdar was probably prominent among them, "You've got to meet this Olcay Ünver." And at the time, he was the president of the Southeastern Anatolia project in Turkey, which was a scheme to dam the Tigris and Euphrates Valley for water and power and economic development. And I said, "Okay, someday I'm sure I will, Ed." And he said, no, you really got to make it a priority. So I took my translator to this project headquarters one day. And I fully expect another, "Welcome to Turkey, thank you," kind of conversations. In fact, I found this young fellow behind the desk, a fellow for whom, as a graduate of the University of Texas, Austin, I needed no translator. And within minutes, instead of exchanging pleasantries, we were talking about some of the development challenges that the issue of damming the Tigris and Euphrates would entail, including dealing with other countries like Iraq under a fellow named Saddam Hussein, and Syria at that time under Hafiz al-Assad, how they felt about Turkey damming the Tigris and Euphrates Valley for the purpose of ensuring development on the Turkish side and raising issues for what happens downstream. So when Turkey decided to take on this challenge of its own, its normal, I suppose, practice was to appoint somebody with political ties to the administration, somebody who's been around for a long time, typically an old man. And instead, there was this young man behind the desk who had not only a knowledge of the project at hand, but interesting, innovative ideas about how to go about it. For the first time, a project of this kind would involve community participation in the affected towns and villages of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. That was innovative. He also certainly had enough diplomatic skill to talk to the Saddams and the Hafiz al-Assad and assure them that this would not be used for political purposes. And it was a tremendous success as of today, while many things have changed in Turkey in the past decade, as you know. This project goes on. There are now 22 dams in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. The people living in the villages of the region for the first time have some influence over what goes on and how these new changes will be dealt with. And in that time, Dr. Ünver has gone on to the UN Food and Agriculture Administration. I tell you this to tell you people who have worked with him through the years have come to understand. If you want something big done, talk to Olcay. I would like to introduce my friend, Dr. Olcay Ünver.
Good afternoon. As you have seen, this was some time ago.
Oh, it was just the other day.
Thank you, Gary. I'm not going to talk about Tigris or Euphrates or Turkey, Syria, Iraq issues. I want to give you a global picture of the challenge of feeding the world by 2050, which is more or less the horizon that the international community has set up. And I'm not going to go into the details, country-level issues. The international community comes together every time that there is an issue that they cannot, countries or country groups cannot solve among themselves, and they go to the United Nations. The United Nations is run by the countries, so it's their forum, and they discuss, and sometimes, every once in a while, they agree on things. One of the things they agreed, and was partly, to some extent, successful, was the Millennium Development Goals, which were negotiated by the countries, and the UN system provided technical support. Millennium Development Goals ended in 2015 with some success, actually remarkable success in certain areas. And one of the areas where it was successful was to deal with the global hunger, malnutrition. And thanks to the efforts of some of the bigger countries, such as China, India, other countries in Asia, some of the sub-Saharan African countries, there was a steady decline in the number of malnourished people, as well as in access to natural resources, and most notably to water resources and sanitation. Now that era has ended, and the international community, right before it ended, again, through a relatively long process, over 2 years, and this time in a much more participatory manner, driven by the member states, rather than the UN systems, technical agencies, and technocrats like me, the countries agreed on 17 sustainable development goals, of which number 2 is dealing with feeding the world, ending hunger, but in a way, differently from the Millennium Development Goals, to do this sustainably, and not only to deal with the hunger and poverty, but to deal with the broad sustainable development that includes natural resources base and people who are not necessarily poor or hungry. And still, feeding the world in a changing environment is a major issue, remains a major issue. One reason is that our population, global population, keeps growing. And according to the UN projections, it will be anywhere between 9 to 10 billion by 2050. There are projections that indicate over 10 billion, but realistically it should be between 9 and 10. Which means that by 2050, the demand for food will be around 50% more compared to the figures in 2013. So 50% more food will need to be provided. OECD projects that water demand will increase also by 50% by 2050. And in order to provide the food that we need, FAO, we predict that we need to provide 11% more water for irrigation purposes. There is a problem here because food demand needs increasing production and a few other things which I will talk about. And given that you have the right input and the determination, production can be increased to some extent. When it comes to water demand, the problem arises because the amount of water on the planet is constant. It's not increasing. And the agriculture is already claiming 70% of global water withdrawals. And this is going to increase. And on top of that, the demand for other purposes, domestic use, energy production, and industries are also increasing. So since we cannot produce, at least economically or feasibly produce a lot more fresh water, we need to do something about that. And if we don't, the World Bank estimates that halfway between now and 2050, in 2030, there will be a gap of 40% between demand and availability of water resources, which is a major concern. Regarding food demand and how we deal with hunger, you see that in this is the number of people suffering from chronic hunger, undernourished. The upper one is the sheer number of people. The lower one is in percentage. And you see that it topped, it maxed around 2003. Then there was a steady decline in the number of undernourished people. And over the past 2 years, unfortunately, the trend reversed. Now we have 815 million people who go to bed hungry every day. And unfortunately, this is over and above all the efforts that it took during the Millennium Development Goals to decrease these numbers. And this is actually an alarm bell because there was so much interest and investment in dealing with hunger. It paid off, though, because in all regions, irrespective of the level of economic or social development, obesity is on the rise. So hunger is on the rise, and at the same time, obesity is on the rise, partly because of the fact that all these development efforts created an environment and a market in which basic foodstuff, with the exception of some years where we had big price hikes, variety of foods were available at reasonable prices. So now we have obesity, both in terms of adult obesity and childhood obesity on rise in all regions. And this has implications in terms of dealing with hunger, but also in terms of managing our natural resource base sustainably. Because in order to feed people, you have to use the natural resources, and sometimes not very sustainably. So in the background of this, we have a degraded resource base. Our land resources, okay, this is not changing, so you cannot maybe read it, but I can. 1/3 of all lands have been classified as degraded across the globe. And that is to the extent that they are not productive. We cannot use them for productive purposes, which is quite bad. On top of that, over the past 150 years, we have managed to destroy 50% of our topsoil, which is obviously the productive part of the soil. And there are other indicators, such as the change in biodiversity, etc., which I will not go into the details. But one thing that is quite recent or understood quite recently is the widespread collapse of insects. It's not only the bees that are collapsing, but it's the insects in general and flying insects in particular. This past November, there was the climate summit in Bonn, COP23, and I was asked to make a speech there, and I looked up the German statistics to find out examples from the host country, and turns out that Germany had lost 70% of its flying insect population. This is alarming, and this obviously has direct and indirect implications on agriculture and food production. What else do we see as impacting our natural resources and our ability to feed the world? Losses. We produce globally about 6 billion tons of food every year, and we lose or waste 1/3 of it. If you think about it, one third of what we produce gets totally lost or wasted. And this is a global figure, but it holds equally in developed countries as well as developing countries. Only the nature of the loss is different. In developing countries, the food is typically lost in the post-harvest stages, such as in storage, in shipment, due to the lack of refrigeration, etc. And in developed countries, food is wasted from the supermarkets on and including our tables. As you see from these figures, we lose 1/5 of the meat and dairy production on a global scale. We lose almost half of the fruits and vegetable production on a global scale. 1/3 of fish and seafood production is lost. And this loss is something that can be actually prevented. And if we were able to prevent 1/4 of this loss, we would have been able to feed the 815 million people that go to hungry every day. In addition to decreasing our ability to feed a growing population, food loss and waste have other implications, and one is the greenhouse gas emissions. When food gets wasted, it rots. Also, the processes that it goes through create greenhouse gas emissions, and when you lose it, then you are impacting climate change in a very negative way. And as a matter of fact, the greenhouse gas emissions that food loss and waste causes on an annual basis is pretty close to the one that is caused by road transport. It's huge. It's more than aviation and iron and steel industries produce altogether. And this can be prevented. Other impacts, they are responsible for about 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and they are also responsible for losing large amounts of water resources. And the example here, this is from my Europe presentation. It's 3 times the volume of Lake Geneva is lost every single year, over and over again. 1/3 of the world's fertile agricultural land is used in vain. And in addition to that, in all the processes, the energy that is used is also lost or wasted. Coming back to the impacts on climate change, food loss and waste, if it were a country, it would come after China and United States in terms of producing greenhouse gas emissions. So the food and agriculture sector, which now I am associated with, is responsible for a number of things that should be changed, including the use of natural resources, primarily water and land resources, and also in dealing with the other aspects of the food value chain, which comes after the production and before we have the food on our tables. What are the prospects? I said earlier, 70% of global water withdrawals is for agriculture. And this will have to increase in order to feed a growing world population. So this has to be made more efficient and more productive. We have to improve our technologies, we have to improve our management systems, and we have to produce more per drop. Again, agriculture is responsible for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that shows also the potentiality to become a part of the solution to climate change. And as a matter of fact, agriculture has very strong potential both for adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and water linkages, both to crop production, livestock, aquaculture, fisheries, forests, is one of the major areas where the international community and countries should think very seriously about in terms of changing their practices. One other aspect that relates to also food loss and waste is the consumption habits. As a matter of fact, that this has been on the international agenda for quite a while, but in meetings, when you go to meetings about food production or water resources management, one discipline that is almost systematically missing is the behavior science. We don't see behavior scientists being a part of these decisions or the behavioral change to become a part of the solution. So this is one of the missing links in finding solutions to both the sustainable development issues and climate change challenges. So are we doomed? We are not. Some of you may recall the doomsday theories, the Malthusian theories, when the population growth would overtake the increases in crop production, and we would all go hungry and die, which didn't happen because of the Green Revolution that took place in 1960s, 50s, 60s. Another Green Revolution with the same circumstances is not possible, because that revolution left its footprint on the environment. It polluted and harmed the environment. So we cannot do it that way. We have to do it more sustainably. And this is where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. And the international community has actually done a real good job in coming up with 17 goals that describe all these aspects and makes them concrete in terms of targets, 169 targets. And then all these targets have their indicators for monitoring purposes. And the international community have signed on in dealing with the sustainable development issues, and including the US government. And the US government has not dropped out of the sustainable development goals. So I'm very happy to note that SDGs provide a very good basis for the countries to deal with the issues of sustainable development, natural resource management, hunger, and consumer behavior. However, sustainable development goals did not come with funding, okay? So funding had to be provided, and that there was a lot of discussions as to establishing a special fund or a bank, and then the international community decided that the existing system to fund development, in this case sustainable development, should be strengthened rather than a new system should be established. And right after this came the Paris Climate Change Accord. The Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, and the Paris Accord came right after that, which was not only a success because the accord was able to bring all the countries together and all the opposing interests and views to converge to a doable plan, but it also came with an idea of funding the programs and projects that would be undertaken by the countries and the stakeholders in order to deal with the mitigation and adaptation issues. A huge fund that would have a budget of $100 billion a year was established under the name of Green Climate Fund, and it's active now. It has its issues of being not mature enough in order to operate fully, and it also has issues of decreased income due to the fact that the US decided to drop out. But it does exist, and it has started funding the projects and programs in developing countries. So that's another global success. And the international community, to a large extent, is abiding by that. And then there is a number of conventions, again, at the global level, including the one on soil degradation. That is the UNCCD, and biodiversity that are also being followed up by member states. What is happening at the global level is, I think, is in the right direction. From that point on, it's up to the individual countries, governments, to actually implement what they have committed themselves to. Because those conventions are binding in the sense that you set up a target and you agree that you would be moving towards that target. But nobody will tell you what to do it and how to do it. And the monitoring, even the monitoring of progress has to be done by the countries, but has to be reported. And again, that's where the UN system comes in. The UN system representing the technical expertise set up by the member states, member governments, have been tasked with providing support in terms of enabling the countries develop their capacities, develop projects and programs, etc., but also monitor their success. For example, my organization, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, is responsible for 29 out of the 169 targets. I am personally responsible one of these targets out of the 29, which is about using water resources efficiently and dealing with water scarcity. So the real challenge now is to actually implement what has been committed by the governments and member states. This is a propaganda slide. These are some of the things that FAO has been doing in dealing with sustainable soil management, food loss and waste, climate change, dealing with ecosystem services, disaster risk reduction, etc. FAO is one of the three largest UN organizations with field offices in over 100 countries, basically in developing countries, to help the governments. And it does maintain a strong technical base, providing support to member states. And one of this is about water scarcity, in which Arizona State University is also involved. The Food and Agriculture Organization led the establishment of a global initiative on water scarcity entitled WASAG, Global Framework on Water Scarcity in Agriculture in a Changing Climate, and launched it during the Climate Summit in Marrakesh 2 years ago. It made a call to governments and specialty organizations, membership organizations, and academia. And a number of organizations decided to become founding members of this initiative. And on the top left corner, ASU is one of the founding members of this initiative. From the US academia, there is Texas A&M, UC Davis. There is Griffith University from Australia and a number of others. Also, UN organizations and governments were founding members of this initiative, which has been established to deal with various aspects of water scarcity. The partners of the initiative decided to establish 5 working groups and focus on 5 important areas. One is about migration, because water resources are very closely linked to migration, both ways. Drought management is another area that the partners decided to work on. Innovative financing mechanisms, the nutritional aspects of water management, and sustainability, productivity, and efficiency issues in agriculture were identified as the priority areas in which now the partners are developing programs and projects to deal with these issues. As a part of this, there will be an international forum in March in Rome at the FAO headquarters on the use of solar energy in agriculture, where Arizona State University is one of the co-organizers along with FAO. So with this, I gave you somewhat an incomplete cross-section of the various aspects that we have to deal with in ending hunger and feeding the world, and at the same time managing our natural resources, including water resources, sustainably. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many other issues, many programs. Other UN agencies are involved, international community is involved, other regional and international organizations do operate in this large continuum of programs, projects, and actions. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Questions, discussion?
You could wait for the mic, please, for questions.
Britt?
Thanks for your talk. I wonder what you were talking a little bit about the green revolution. I wonder what role you see technology playing in the current challenges. So for example, I know that people are talking about genetically modifying certain food crops to require less water input. So I'm curious what the FAO is thinking about those types of options, whether they're seen as promising or overly risky, or kind of what your thinking is about that.
Yes. GMOs have become obviously very controversial. FAO does not have a position in either way. But what the discussion about GMOs has caused was an overshadowing of the options that come with technology. A lot of people now have the idea that if you are improving seeds, for example, it's bad because GMOs are bad. I'm not saying that GMOs are bad or good, but given the discussions, other aspects of technology unfortunately have been impacted very negatively, overshadowed, and in many cases underfunded or under-addressed. There is a lot of potential through technology. I'm not talking about seeds only. I'm talking about agricultural technology in general, but yes, drought-resistant crops. That's great potential there, and that is not GMOs. That it's different, but lesser understood. Better livestock practices, using technology in livestock management. That's there is a good example about improving livestock, because livestock, obviously, livestock is a main contributor to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and moving to more productive livestock will actually decrease greenhouse gas emissions coming from livestock, because instead of having X number of animals to produce the same nutritional outcome, you will have a much lesser number of animals producing the same outcome, and that would also cause less greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a lot of developments and research in that area. Other large-scale agricultural practices, for example, rice production, is another major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a lot of pilot-level successes with changing the methodology, irrigation of rice, for example, with alternate drying, wetting, for example. You can actually have a positive impact in terms of climate change. Technology also can play a major impact in using natural resources more efficiently, for example, water resources. But this does not necessarily mean that, for example, moving from surface irrigation to drip irrigation will save a lot of water or will produce a lot more food, if you are not also making it a part of the package and improving your management practices, improving the health of soil, looking after sustainable soil management, etc. So the bigger picture is more important than the individual components of technology. Oh, I'm sorry.
I am Jagadish. The population is increasing here, and rapid urbanization has encroached the farmland, right? So there is a lesser farmland. So in addition to this, the cost of farming is increasing, and then the cost of the product of the agriculture is increased, right? So in this condition, how can we be so optimistic to feed this 9 million people by 2050? How do you think?
the cost of land is increasing in certain places, but there is plenty of land that can be used still productively. That is extensive management or extensive agriculture. Then there is a lot of potential for sustainable intensification. So using the same amount of land, but using it multiple times in a year or using it more productively. The output, the yield can be increased very much substantially. Introducing water in areas where dry land agriculture is practiced, or supplementary irrigation. Those are all, they promise a lot of prospects that have not been adequately used. So there is reason for optimism.
Thanks for a really provocative and useful topic. Just FYI, there is a large food systems transformation group at ASU that is focused specifically on waste and doing some very interesting projects with Kellogg and others on that. And so I certainly would recommend that you connect with them. My question was, as we think about the future, and as you think about the future, it's pretty clear with food, as it is with energy, which is the area that I work in, that that 2050 isn't just about the material inputs to the food regime. It's about the cultural transformations around food. And I'm thinking, you know, I mean, obviously, the genetic engineering question is in part a technology question, but it's also in part a cultural question about what consumers will and will not choose to eat. As is the global vegetarianism movement, as is the politics of cattle agriculture in India that's been in the news the last few months. Around the Hindu Nationalist Party and their recent moves, as well as the sort of violence that's happening around cattle production there. It seems pretty clear that by 2050 there are going to be, there are likely to still be significant kinds of new cultural movements around food, whether organics as well in the United States on the one hand, and on the other hand, the continued shift in diets towards refined sugars, refined grains that have contributed to those obesity numbers that you showed us, right? So how, as the FAO, do you bring these kinds of, do you bring conversations about the future of culture around food into your conversations?
Well, thank you, first of all, for your remarks. You covered a good number of points that I did not. So thank you for that. FAO, as a part of the UN system, FAO is a specialty agency, but it's run by governments. So when, for example, if FAO would have a position on GMOs, then that would have been discussed by the governments in a intergovernmental forum, and then there would be a verdict, or they would decide that they cannot agree, so there would be no position. So it's not a technical position to be taken by an agency. FAO provides not only a forum for governments to discuss things, which would relate to some of your questions, but FAO provides secretarial services and hosts a multi-stakeholder forum called CFS, that is Committee on Global Food Security. Okay. This is a multi-stakeholder forum in its nature, which means that governments, civil society, and the corporate world, businesses, are a part of this. And they do meet once a year. Every year they have a topic on their agenda and they discuss it, transparently and exhaustively. I was very closely involved 2 years ago when the topic was water management. So they really exhaustively discuss. Governments bring their top experts, and so do the NGOs, the civil society, the corporate world, and in coming up with 9 recommendations. They worked 3 full days, including nights, until the morning, and the 9 recommendations they came up with represented workable, implementable compromises or agreements, however you look at it, that these 3 sectors discussed and agreed on. So I am foreseeing that a good number of what you mentioned will be discussed in this forum and similar forums between now and 2050 or whatever. But as they become more important on either the international agenda or the agenda of the individual countries.
Yes. Dr. Ünver, thank you very much for coming here and spending a few days with us, and especially enlightening us with one of the stubborn problems of our time, food security. I want to be optimist, and I'm an optimistic person, but like many in this room, I also have my doubt about the future ability to feed, especially knowing that most of the technological innovations of the past has systematically marginalized the marginalized people, especially the small farmers.
Absolutely.
and those. And also knowing that they provides 4/5 of the food production for the developing world or less developed settings. So are there anything specific at the global level that we are talking about addressing these group of people? I would be happy to hear
Yes.
that.
Again, it will sound like a propaganda. And of course, FAO is not the whole world, okay? FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So when we are talking about the international community, it's more or less normal that you think in terms of its specialty agencies, because when FAO conference, which is like the General Assembly, meets, it's the, all of the agriculture ministers of the world will come and discuss things along with their delegations. 5 years ago, FAO decided to revisit its strategic framework and align its policies with the needs and the developments. And established, after long discussions, again at the intergovernmental level, 5 strategic objectives. For example, the first strategic objective is zero hunger, ending hunger in its all forms. The second strategic objective is sustainable and productive management of natural resources. The fourth objective is about smallholders, is about advocating the smallholders, increasing their resilience, and enabling them to reach to markets, to reach to safety nets, to reach to financial tools, and to be protected by governments through regulations and special programs. So that has become one of the pillars of the strategies and policies of FAO, developed and approved by member states, to the extent that 2014 was designated as the year of smallholder farmers, and all year long that there were programs, advocacy programs, projects, etc., done to highlight their issues and to do something about them. It is recognized. It's been put in global frameworks. But your skepticism should continue because these need to be implemented by governments. So governments coming to international meetings, international forums, and agreeing to do something is absolutely good and essential, but it has to be followed up and implemented. So, I would support your skepticism, but maybe skeptic optimism or however you call it. But it's recognized.
Mike here, and probably one more question after this.
Okay, this is a quick question. Thank you for your talk. When you look at specifically at the efficiency and use of water, okay, in a growing population marching towards 9 billion and beyond, do you specifically or somebody at the FAO look at garbage, where we as globally will put our garbage?
Garbage is put in programs in multiple ways. One, of course, in the context of contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change context. The other one in terms of composting prospects that garbage offers. And actually, FAO has handbooks about composting, encouraging people to turn their garbage into compost and use it for either gardening or larger scale agriculture. Then not necessarily garbage, but also FAO and World Health Organization have jointly developed guidelines and technical guidebooks in terms of using wastewater and groundwater in agriculture, both in terms of peri-urban agriculture and in urban settings.
Thank you so much for coming and for giving this talk. I have a question that is a spin-off of what Clark's was. So much of our time on food has been focused on production, but research has established that it is not just production of food that we need to worry about, it's access, it's cost. And all of those are conversations that are equally, if not more important than production itself. So because food is a systems thing that we have to do, the conversation has to start at the intergovernmental level with Ministry of Agriculture that you said. Has those conversations started or are they ongoing in FAO? Because I do not think we can have the solution 2050 based on the old model of just focusing on production. So would you like to say something about that, please? Thank you.
I apologize for misleading you to believe that FAO works on production aspects only. This is why I covered food loss and waste. FAO works on food loss and waste. Actually, FAO works on the whole food value chain. It has partnerships with the private sector, with a lot of the food companies, the industry, in order to make the overall value chain more productive, less wasteful, and more efficient. When I talk about water efficiency, it also applies. 70% is used for production purposes, but a good part of the remaining 30% comes in the post-harvest stage, in either in terms of shipping, refrigeration. Water is embedded in all of these processes and most everything that we produce and use. So Yes, FAO looks at the overall value chain.
One last question to solve the big one in the next minute and a half, Olcay. A recurring theme in a lot of the questions, a lot of the skepticism, is not so much from the point of view of technological fixes, they may exist, new agricultural techniques or waste management techniques may exist. The heavy lift, the real concern, I think, among a number of us, is the political environment in which this is going to take place. If we look at another area, 32 years ago, which is the length of time, of course, to 2050, 32 years ago, we were a lot farther along, for example, with nuclear proliferation, that the behemoth nations had agreed on a way forward, and things look better. 32 years later, it's far more unsafe in this arena. So while, you know, doomsday apocalypse may be possible, I guess the far stronger probability is, you know, bit by bit, the world gets more degraded. Bit by bit, life gets more difficult for the people that Netra speaks about, and we have kind of ruined our planet. Is there anything that you think happening at the political level, in a serious kind of way, that would give us optimism in a situation where it seems that almost anyone can be elected to high office in the countries of the world? How do we cope with this politically?
Okay. Okay, this is not a question to an FAO employee, so I'll give you a personal answer. So that's the disclaimer for the recording. Actually, you know, all along I've indicated that, you know, commitments. I'm happy with the commitments, Sustainable Development Goals. I think they are very good. The Paris Accord was the best that could have been reached given the circumstances. Okay. And those show political commitment at the level of principles and overall targets and policies, and in terms of where we want to be in 15 years' time, or by 2030, or by 2050. But implementing this, there are two issues. One is implementing in general. The other one is funding. Okay. And the two are not necessarily the same thing, because you may want to be committed to implementation, and you may not be given the funds for various reasons, including potentially political reasons. Paris Accord is great, but if the $100 billion a year materializes and is used properly, monitored properly, and the expected results are taken. So, you know, skepticism should be maintained. And a lot of these will need political commitment. And when it comes to, for example, things like climate accord, I guess there will be a need for champions, climate champions. And this could be the European Union. This could be China. Okay, and I'm saying this irrespective of political regimes. Okay, it's very possible that a regime that you don't agree with can take a positive leadership in one of these issues. Having said this, last week the 2018 report, Global Risks Report of Global Economic Forum was published. It's brand new. Please do Google it. They have very good graphics and very impressive. And they do a good job highlighting the risks. Okay. I think for the 6th year in a row, water crises remained among the top 5 risks. Okay. The inability to deal with climate change remains to be a risk. Again, I think this year it's #1 risk. because of what happened, mostly in terms of U.S. not agreeing with the Paris Accord. I think it was number 3 last year, and it became number 1 this year. So these are risks. They are acknowledged, and globally, in Davos, the leaders are expected to talk about these. And this report was published the week prior to Davos, so it could establish the basis for some of the discussions there.
Dr. Ünver, thank you on behalf of the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and ASU. Thank you for coming. You've given us a lot to talk about. You've given us a lot to do. And so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.